Good afternoon, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the Royal Australian Air Force for inviting me to speak to this distinguished audience. I realize that I'm the last one standing between you and lunch, so I'll do my best to hold your attention for the next 30 minutes. What I've been asked to do today is to talk about the integrated force and live, virtual, and constructive training, which I realize is quite a mouthful, so I'll be referring to it as LVC. On November 17th, 2011, General Martin Dempsey, then chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, asked a question: what's after joint? What he meant was, how do we do a better job at integrating new aspects or rapidly evolving aspects of warfare, like cyber or electronic? 6 years later, the U.S. Army answered with their multi-domain battle concept, while today, the U.S. Air Force is finalizing their concept of multi-domain command and control. To cut a long story short, what multi-domain battle seeks to do is move beyond services as organizing constructs to instead harness joint experience to produce integrated effects through multiple domains: air, land, sea, space, cyber. Oh God, I turned it off. You can tell I'm like, despite working at a tech institution, I'm not tech savvy. All right, I got this. All right, so this past June, speaking here in Canberra at ASPE, Vice Admiral Ray Griggs, the Vice Chief of the Defense Force, noted that joint was now a limiting descriptor. And while multi-domain struck him as a bit of a faddish concept, the key he noted to the integrated force is the future force is the integrated force, integrated at an organizational level, as well as culturally and technically. He advocated for what he called a one-domain concept that moves away from service and domain-level silos. Putting aside these debates over semantics, it's clear there's a sense that we need to work more seamlessly between services and domains by focusing instead on the desired effects that one wants to bring to bear in an adversary, rather than on a given service or domain. Thinking along these lines should give warfighters and decision-makers increased options, all while multiplying our adversaries' challenges. There's also a recognition that technology on its own will not be a panacea, that the way militaries choose to fight, seamlessly integrating kinetic and non-kinetic operations, will also influence the outcome on the battlefield. We need a truly integrated force across service, domain, and kinetic and non-kinetic operations. In today's operating environment, such integration is necessary. Potential adversaries, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, have invested heavily in a range of military capabilities with the intention of depriving the US, allies, and coalition partners the capacity to project power into their near abroad. Labeled anti-access, area denial, these capabilities afford their owners a degree of strategic depth by raising the risk and cost of intervention. In tandem, these capabilities have provided cover for other more revisionist actions. Russia and China in particular have manifested an iridescent proclivity for gray zone approaches or salami slicing tactics that stay just below the threshold of armed conflict, but nevertheless have already insidiously changed the status quo in their respective regions. Moreover, potential adversaries have recognized that conflict is not solely defined by the exchange of fires, that shaping the information environment through lawfare, economic statecraft, and information operations can also serve geopolitical ends. While these asymmetric strategies may differ in their capabilities or tactics, they all rely heavily on cyber, electronic, and information operations. Our militaries must be able to fight in and through an increasingly contested and complex battle space. And they must be able to bring those same cyber, electronic, and information operations to bear as force multipliers for more lethal effect. So the question becomes, how should militaries fight as an integrated force in these contested environments? And then how do you train for that? LVC provides the environment necessary for more integrated training, all while providing a high-fidelity rendition of the military's current and future operating environment. There are three types of techniques militaries use for LVC. So you've got live, real people operating in a real environment; virtual, real people operating in a simulated environment; and constructive, simulated people or equipment operating in a simulated environment. LVC entails linking live aircraft with manned simulators in the virtual world and computer-generated constructive forces. LVC is increasingly beneficial today because the live environment is not conducive to many of the training needs of the fifth generation force. For instance, like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Live training ranges are spatially too restricted for fifth generation training. They often fail to produce realistic fifth generation threat scenarios. There's also the perennial concern linked to inadvertently revealing the unique warfighting attributes of fifth generation platforms. And then last but not least, the live environment fails to integrate with fidelity, cyber, electronic, and information operations. So of course, nothing can replace the sensations derived from the dust, sweat, and adrenaline of the live environment. But in some cases, however, it may well turn out that when preparing for the future contested and complex battle space, that the synthetic training environment may actually prove more realistic. Indeed, to truly achieve an integrated force along the lines of multi-domain or one-domain battle, or even Plan Jericho for that matter, training will need to be increasingly pushed into the virtual and constructive environments. I'm now going to try to spend the rest of my talk explaining why. And the rest of my presentation is going to be structured in 4 parts. So first, I'm going to discuss the need for military forces to train to fight in and through a contested environment saturated by adversary cyber and electronic operations. I'll also detail how the military and the defense industrial base can begin to conceptualize injecting cyber and electronic effects into the synthetic training environment. I'll then discuss why it's necessary for the military to train for offensive, integrated, kinetic and non-kinetic operations, looking specifically at some of the challenges unique to integrating offensive cyber operations with more conventional operations. I'm going to detail some really interesting initial work that integrates kinetic and non-kinetic synthetic environments. I'm then going to switch over and look more broadly at today's information environment. In particular, how we're starting to see cyber and electronic operations converge with social media, big data, artificial intelligence, alongside more traditional information operations like psychological operations or military deception to influence the information and cognitive dimensions of the battle space. I'll talk a little bit about why training for these types of operations must occur synthetically and how the environment needs to evolve to provide the warfighter that experiential learning prior to combat. Finally, I'll conclude by exploring how the synthetic training environment is uniquely suited for the military to experiment, to design new operating concepts and tactics, techniques, and procedures for this future battle space. So, in December 2011, Iranian cyber warriors alleged that they hacked into an RQ-170 stealth UAV operating near the Iran-Afghan border. Iranian cyber warriors claim they spoofed the UAV's navigation control, sending it false GPS coordinates. They also claim they jammed the UAV's communications, forcing the system into autopilot mode, meaning it would have to rely on its GPS to return to its base in Afghanistan. If true, the false GPS coordinates fooled the RQ-170 into thinking it was close to home, so it landed in Iranian territory. So it's unclear in the open source literature whether Iran did conduct a cyber or electronic attack on a stealth UAV. But unencrypted UAVs have been spoofed and their feeds have been intercepted in the past. However, regardless if this incident is true, what the RQ-170 incident does indicate is that the cybersecurity of our military platforms and systems are of utmost importance. It seems self-evident that any complex system with high interconnectivity will have the cybersecurity vulnerabilities. We all know that the same capabilities that give us a certain technological edge over certain key competitors also present unique cybersecurity risks. Military systems can fall prey to adversary cyber operations for the purposes of espionage, sabotage, or subversion. Information security professionals often refer to what they call the CIA triad. These practitioners work to ensure the C, confidentiality, I, integrity, and A, availability of data within a system. While this model is typically used to guide information security policy, it also provides a really useful starting point to start to extrapolate how adversaries might try to undermine military systems and platforms. Adversaries will work to undermine the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of military platforms and their communications backbone. In combat, the networked attacks that the military will most likely face are availability threats, distributive denial of service, jamming. Enemies could also manipulate the microelectronic supply chain or employ cyber attacks to sabotage communication networks or key weapon systems. The confidentiality of data on weapon system capabilities or vulnerabilities could be revealed via cyber espionage. By accessing command and control networks, adversaries could also glean intelligence on operational planning and decision-making. Finally, the integrity of system information could be compromised via spoofing or the insertion of false information. Synthetic training must evolve for these types of cyber attacks. But how? Exactly how a platform or a system is disrupted by a cyber attack depends, of course, on the details of that system. This requires a deep understanding of how that system works. For instance, how an SA-400 surface-to-air missile works. But it also requires an understanding of how the system parameters are set and how that system fits into the broader network. And this understanding needs to evolve as the platform changes, with each software update, each patch, each new interconnection, etc. Moreover, cyber exploits are evolving. They aren't static. They reflect the tacit knowledge learned by the hacking community. What they choose to target and how they've structured an exploit will have different effects on a system. So it may be impossible to model all the possible effects of a computer network attack on a system. However, that doesn't mean that developing a suite of simulated cyber injects that may be slightly divorced from reality is not helpful. Given the number of ways that a cyber attack can impact a system, the goal should be to get the trainee to troubleshoot a diverse range of effects and creatively identify ways to maintain mission assurance despite the attack. How should a pilot react if their GPS coordinates no longer seem to reflect reality? What should they do when the primary interface between their aircraft and their weapons are sabotaged? What if their fire control radar no longer seems, the information of the fire control radar does not reflect previous information of the mission? In some cases, the pilot may need to turn back. In other cases, they could troubleshoot and carry on with the mission. They need to be trained to each of these ends. We need to start to think about how we can evolve our suite of synthetic training options to include these scenarios and others. On September 6, 2007, Israeli F-15 Eagles and F-16 Falcons bombed a North Korean-designed nuclear facility in Syria. Even though these aircraft are far from stealthy, they were invisible to Syria's Russian-built air defense network. So what happened? The images on Syria's radar screens weren't real. They depicted what the Israeli military had put there through cyber means. And while there are various theories on how Israel may have penetrated Syria's air defense network, one thing is clear. The Israeli Air Force had successfully, skillfully integrated kinetic and non-kinetic operations. More recently, from late 2014 through 2016, Russian malware was covertly implanted in a legitimate Android application developed for the Ukrainian artillery. The original application, used by over 9,000 Ukrainian artillery personnel, enabled artillery forces to process targeting data for the Soviet-era D-30 howitzer. The deployment of the malware likely facilitated superior Russian reconnaissance and targeting of Ukrainian artillery units. Some folks have assessed that between 15 and 20% of the Ukrainian D-30 inventory has since been lost in combat operations. So it's obvious that cyber and electronic operations can be used as a force multiplier or a support function in conflict. But that's easier said than done. Current LVC training for cyber operators tends to focus entirely on the cyber aspect of operations, and it often ignores the broader picture, placing it at odds with the realities of cyber support on the battlefield. Conventional warfighters tend to see cyber as a strategic capability, rather than something that can also be applied tactically as part of a range of mission effects. Few training opportunities, if any, exist for the conventional warfighter to gain a broader understanding of how they can best leverage cyber capabilities at the tactical or operational level. The US Air Force knows that if its ambition is to have a multi-domain force, they need to produce airmen that know how to combine air, space, and cyber together for more lethal effect. Yet a gulf exists between those cyber warriors that are assigned to cyber protection teams and those that are assigned to support conventional forces as part of cyber mission teams. Some of the stuff we've seen during recent red flags do show some promise. However, much more needs to be done. New training and tools need to be developed to support this type of training. So for instance, one could imagine a scenario where a cyber combat mission team has gained access to an adversary's air operations center. They now can understand how an adversary plans to deploy air power in a given theater of operations. If the cyber combat missions team connection is via fiber optic cable, it's in their interest to ensure that friendly forces do not damage that cable during operations. However, that same fiber optic cable could run across a bridge that friendly forces seek to deny to an adversary. Coordination and integration across the force needs to take place, as bombing that bridge could deny the cyber combat mission team vital mission intelligence. So, however, perhaps more importantly than just designing combined cyber-kinetic scenarios, warfighters must better understand the strengths and weaknesses that cyber brings to the fight. And this is something that could be developed through integrated synthetic training. Cyber brings unique attributes that differ significantly from more conventional weapons. For example, the timing and sequencing of non-kinetic and kinetic attacks can be challenging. Targets cannot necessarily be hit at a moment's notice. Cyber operators often take months or even years to work through the cyber kill chain, from reconnaissance to exploit development, delivery, vulnerability exploitation, malware installation, remote manipulation, to finally achieving their objectives. Plus, obviously, the more critical a system is to an adversary, the more likely it's highly protected and the more difficult it will be to penetrate. However, once a system is penetrated, the effects of a cyber attack can be near instantaneous, requiring rapid reaction on the part of more conventional warfighters so that everything is nicely synchronized. Secondly, warfighters and commanders need to know what a cyber attack will do to a target. In the US, the Department of Defense has developed joint munitions effectiveness manuals, which indicates the characteristics and size of a kinetic weapon's detonation. The effect of a cyber attack, unlike a kinetic weapon, isn't dependent on the weapon or malware itself. Its effects are based on the system that it is targeting. Therefore, it's likely impossible that one can precisely know the exact effects of a cyber attack on a system. Instead, what is required is the ability to quickly do battle damage assessments, feeding that information back to the commander or warfighter for their subsequent action or decision. Furthermore, combat in cyberspace can be a rapid measure-countermeasure game. The effect of a cyber attack isn't necessarily permanent. Target system administrators can restore system functionality and integrity. Therefore, it's not enough to just integrate non-kinetic and kinetic effects. Cyber and electronic operations must be synchronized and layered in time and space. So, what is needed is a sandbox, a place where warfighters and commanders can experiment, a place where they can start to imagine what these integrated operations look like. We need to start to identify ways where we can integrate cyber simulators or ranges with kinetic simulators, allowing the effects in one environment to change the environment or the computer-generated forces in the other. And so this type of integration has actually already been demonstrated. In 2016, at ITSEC Blended Warrior, a cyber kinetic effects integrator was showcased. A team at Carnegie Mellon developed a program that bridged their cyber synthetic environment with a third-party kinetic mission training program. The program would detect changes in the cyber environment, like, for instance, the triggering of an alarm, which would then be reflected in the kinetic mission training program. Carnegie modeled all of the systems involved in the mission so that warfighters could creatively determine the best path to success. The synthetic nature of the environment allowed it to be continuously reset so that teams could develop and test new operational concepts as well as tactics, techniques, and procedures. So I think the time is right for Australia to start thinking more about this, particularly with the recent inauguration of Defence SIGINT and Cyber Command. How can the Australian Defence Force start to integrate their new cyber command with conventional warfighters? The use of cyber and electronic operations extends beyond the sabotage, subversion, or espionage of platforms and systems. The information environment has changed, and adversaries have increasingly sought to level the playing field through the adept use of information. At its core, strategy is about the human mind. It's about the ability to bend an adversary to your will. Information operations employ tools, any tool, to shape the information environment, whether that's undermining adversary decision-making or creating conditions for various entities to make decisions that benefit friendly force missions. From the use of cyber and information operations in the Russo-Georgia War to the blending of electronic, information, and cyber operations in Ukraine, Russia is preparing to fight and win partially through shaping the information environment. So are our non-state adversaries. For example, during Operation Valhalla in 2006, US Special Forces engaged a Jaish al-Mahdi death squad. They killed 16, captured 17, destroyed a weapons cache, and rescued a hostage. Shortly after US Special Forces had left the site, Jaish al-Mahdi fighters returned, and they rearranged their fallen comrades on prayer mats, making it look like they had been slaughtered while praying. They released press releases of the alleged atrocity in English and Arabic on social media, and it took the US 3 days to respond with their story. And by that point, the success of their mission had been undermined. In some cases, training for information operations can be done in a live environment. For instance, USAF's use of an EC-130J aircraft to broadcast their own signal over radio or television, or to override broadcast stations on the ground. Likewise, an exercise Viking, which simulates training for peace operations and crisis management, a media gaming cell injects different types of news into the scenario, forcing the participants to manage media response. However, in other instances, when cyber, electronic, artificial intelligence, bots may be involved, the live and training environment will fail to mimic with fidelity the information environment. Moreover, the use of those capabilities in a live environment may risk revealing them to ever-curious adversaries. While the integration of cyber and electronic effects into LVC training is still in its infancy, information operations are routinely discounted or underutilized in training. And this is surprising, as information operations have historically been a key component of integrated operations, and they will remain so in the future. Indeed, the need for the military to shape the information space is not new. During World War II, Allies mounted an elaborate deception and misinformation campaign, causing German attention to be diverted from the beaches of Normandy to Norway in the Pas de Calais. 4 years earlier, Germans had themselves misled the Allies, causing them to concentrate their troops in northern France on the Belgian border, rather than in the Ardennes prior to Germany's blitzkrieg offensive through the forest. More recently, we have seen operations live tweeted in real time by unwitting civilian observers. In 2011, a Pakistani live tweeted the US raid on Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad. While his tweets had no operational impact, one should wonder what the operational impact of that could have been today, now that countries have much more exquisite social media data mining capabilities. What would have happened if the ISI, the Pakistani Military Intelligence Service, had caught wind of the ongoing operation in real time? Information operations exclusion or marginalization in LVC exercises can be often explained by their difficulty in simulating the effects over the exercise's time period. Moreover, when one starts to include military deception, psychological operations, public affairs, electronic warfare, and cyber, the modeling and simulation challenge grows exponentially. How do you model the complexities of the physical, technical, and cognitive dimensions of the battle space? We need to start working towards this future. We need to start to identify ways how our adversaries plan to use information operations in battle, so we can accurately model those for the warfighter. How will we and our adversaries use information operations for psychological warfare, command and control warfare, denial, and deception? So there are some interesting opportunities emerging for synthetic information operations training. Indeed, virtual training environments have started to emerge that emulate social media, These environments could be used to train intelligence officers, but they could also be used to train warfighters, like cyber or information warriors, to find and identify esoteric pieces of information that may actually have an impact on mission assurance. The potential for these types of training environments are immense, as they could be used to experiment and train for psychological operations, intelligence gathering, and public affairs. Training goal dependent, integrating these types of environments with other traditional platform-based synthetic training environments could provide multiple trainees with a deeper understanding of how the information environment may impact mission assurance, or how they can leverage information operations for more lethal effect. Developing interfaces that bridge these environments, propagating effects across these environments, would provide warfighters a test bed for information operations prior to the crucible of combat. So according to the Department of Defense's military dictionary, readiness is the ability of military forces to fight and meet the demands of assigned missions. Moving beyond this somewhat broad definition, readiness at its core depends on the articulation of a coherent strategy. The military must describe what it must be ready for, when it must be ready, and what components of a force structure should be maintained in a state of readiness. If that's not challenging enough, defense planners must then decide what inputs to readiness, personnel, equipment, sustainment, and training should be allocated to achieve those ends. Readiness requires not just a trained force, but a trained force that can meet the strategic and operational requirements of future wars. LVC is not simply a training platform. It's also a tool for innovation and experimentation. New operational concepts, doctrines, technologies, and integrated force structures can be tested in virtual worlds that can evolve autonomously to reflect changing requirements. LVC provides the environment to experiment, potentially fail, regroup, and adopt innovations before the first shot is fired or the first sortie is deployed. Achieving a truly integrated force that breaks down service and domain-level silos should not be considered a finite objective, but an ongoing pursuit, a moving target as warfare evolves and forces us to innovate. An integrated force should be intrinsically tied to readiness. We need to experiment and then develop synergy across the force through realistic and repetitive training. As the Australian Defence Force begins to conceptualize how they can best integrate cyber, electronic, and information effects, particularly with the recent inauguration of the new Defence SIGINT and Cyber Command, LVC should provide a path forward. And with that, I think I'll end there, so thank you very much.